Okay guys, I am doing the mixing demo for the Corona inspired Memento Mori painting. In this painting I have our full palette out, so that's cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, burnt umber, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and phthalo green, and then white. This is also just a little bit of wax medium, which I may be using in the painting as well. And then you could also, of course, get some liquid out on your palette. You'll need that liquid or your Gamblin solvent-free gel. Okay, so let's talk about, before I start mixing, the general color palette for this painting. So the still life has been lit with a red bulb. So the red is influencing not only the color of the light masses, which you can see are going very warm, particularly you can see that in the white objects, so the skull and the toilet paper. The light masses are not just sort of a typical lighter white, even though it's a white object. They're going very warm, so they're going yellow and orange and red. But it's also influencing parts of the shadows, and it's particularly evident in the skull, where parts of that light mass are going kind of this rosy red, but then parts of the shadows are actually going quite green. So that's what happens with light logic and color combining together. When there's a warm light source, the shadows are going to be cool, and the reverse is true as well. So when there's a cool light source, the shadows are going to be warm. Okay, so let's get started mixing. I put a lot of ultramarine blue out on my palette because I'm going to be mixing a big part of a lot of a cool neutral with the ultramarine blue and the burnt umber. Because we're working with a black tablecloth in this composition. So I'm going to mix out a value scale of this cool neutral, and something like this will be for the really dark portions. So parts of the background get very dark, parts of the folds get very dark as well. But when I start to mix out some of my lighter values, I'm actually going to be adding in some cadmium red, because we can see if we're looking at the light on the tablecloth, so if we're looking at the top of that tablecloth, you know, by the book, by the skull, we can see that there's a red tint to it, right? And it's a warm red. It was a warm red bulb. So cadmium red is our warm red, so we'll be using a bit of that, adding that into some of the lighter values that we're going to mix out for this cool neutral. Okay, so we can see here that I'm essentially mixing my own black from ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And remember, it's kind of nice being able to mix your own blacks, because essentially you can customize this neutral. You can push it warmer or cooler as you need to, versus a black straight out the tube doesn't have the same sort of color, dynamic color potential. It feels a lot more dead on the palette than a neutral that you're mixing yourself. Okay, so I'm going to start to mix out a few values of this. Okay, so let's bring a big chunk of this down here. Okay. And now, I'm not just going to mix white into it. I'm going to mix, and when I'm cleaning off my palette knife, I'm not just putting the paint right on the part of the paper towel that I'm holding. I've folded it and I stick it in between here and then wipe it off. so that I'm not touching any part of the paper towel that has paint on it. So that's a way of keeping your hands clean, which we really want to try to do, especially as we're working with pigments like the cadmiums. You do not want to get that on your skin, okay? So be smart in how you handle your paper towel. Anyway, I'm going to grab not only some white to make my gray, but again, with this red bulb, it's making all of the light very warm and it's giving it a red tint. So I'm also going to be adding in some red into here. And this cadmium red is kind of like a mid-value color, so that it's also going to help to lighten this. Okay. So I'm going to mix more of my cadmium red into here. It's going to be aiming for kind of a mid-tone. Okay, getting more of my cadmium red. Put that in there. And I can already tell I'm going to need much more cadmium red on my palette. Okay, so this gives us this lovely reddish black. Alright, I'm going to mix I'll keep this right here. And I'll mix a value in between what I've just mixed and then also between this. Now I want to keep a relatively large pile of this really dark neutral, because there's a lot of black in that background that I'll want to save that for. And you want to try to mix more of that now versus having to remix it over the course of the painting, which again is why I put so much ultramarine blue down on my palette. Okay, let's mix one more step in between these two. Okay, grab that, put that there. Grab a little bit more of this black that I've made. Okay, so we can see that as I'm getting lighter, I'm getting warmer, right? Warm light, and then as I'm getting cooler, it's getting darker. So the shadows are cooler, the lights are getting warmer. So I'm going to let me grab a little bit more of my cadmium red. I'm going to need more of that. So there's a lot of cadmium red in this painting. There's also quite a bit of the ultramarine blue that you'll need, and then the burnt umber combination for that tablecloth and for the really dark values. Okay, so let's put some steps down. Okay. One step right there. Step right here. Alright. Now, let's even try getting quite a bit of this red and adding it to this and see what that looks like. We may also need to add a little bit of one of our yellows to get the lighter portions of the tablecloth. But let's first add the red. Let's see if that works. Now, if you want to check what you're mixing against what you're trying to paint, you mix it out, right? Mix, mix, mix. Make sure it's fully mixed. And then you can hold up what you've mixed against your reference. So that reference could be a still life that you actually have right in front of you that you're trying to paint from. Or it could also be holding it up to your photo reference, right? So taking your palette knife, holding that up to your reference, gauging them against each other, seeing if it looks accurate. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is, this is looking pretty nice. I'm gonna mix one more where I take some of this, put it down here, and I am going to add a little bit of yellow ochre into this. So this is for the parts of this black tablecloth that have quite a bit of light on them. I noticed they're going a little bit warmer. There's a little bit more of kind of a golden hue in there. So the yellow ochre is what you want to use. The cadmium yellow is probably too intense for this. Let's get a little more. Okay. So very warm light. A very warm light bulb gives us warm lights going towards red and yellow, and the shadows go really cool. Okay, so now I'm going to take this lighter red that I've mixed and mix a couple of values in between. So with the red bulb that I've used, that red is permeating all the different value scales that we'll be mixing out. So there's going to be kind of red throughout the painting. Now I also used a red bulb, to emulate some of the really warm lighting situations that were in those Flemish still lifes, because those still lifes could have been lit by candlelight, for example. So they would have had that red and orange kind of hue to them. Okay, so now we have a nice little value scale, and again, kind of like always, I've mixed out my value scale, but then of course I'll have to see what these look like when I start to paint, and how they look on the painting itself. And I can always be checking the values and the colors I've mixed against my photo references, but then you also just have to pay attention that as you start to paint, does it look and feel accurate? And if not, what does it need? Does it need a little bit more yellow? You need some darker tones? So always pay attention to what the sort of painting process is telling you as well. Okay, so we've mixed out a value scale to address the background and to address the whole sort of tablecloth, which is quite a bit of the painting, right? Now, and this is a very dark value scale based in the ultramarine blue and the burnt umber going into red. I can also take some of this and use that right down there. I'm going to add a bunch of the alizarin crimson into it. I'm going to mix out a little value scale for the wine glass. So the wine itself is a very dark red liquid, and goes very, very dark in this painting. Okay, so that ultramarine blue neutral helps us to make a really dark red. I'm going to take some of this down, add a little bit more of my alizarin crimson into here to get something that's a little bit more chromatic too. Okay, and then the wine glass itself has these reflections in it. It's picking up reflections from things around it, and the reflections are going a warm red. Okay, and you can use some of these colors for that when you're looking through the glass, you're seeing through it, the tablecloth through, you can use some of those colors directly from this value scale. But let's mix out a color and a value for those reflections. So I'm going to take some of this, bring it down. I'm also going to take some of this more kind of brownish color from over here, put that right there. I'm going to take the cadmium and put a bunch of that cadmium in there, which is going to lighten this. Okay, so this will work for some of the reflections. Then some of the reflections are also quite yellow, and then there are some parts that go quite bright as well. We'll add some white into that. Okay, so I'm going to mix a couple of different options. So I'm going to start by mixing a warmer version of this with some more of the yellow ochre. Okay, yellow ochre in there, lightens it and warms it up even more. Okay, and I'm going to mix an even warmer version of this, a warmer and more chromatic version. So I'll take some of what I have on my palette knife, put that down right there, and I'm going to grab the cadmium yellow, which is a much more chromatic yellow than the yellow ochre, right? Which also has a very lightening effect, warm and lightening effect. Okay. Let's add a little bit more of the cadmium red into this mixture. Alright, and now I'm going to take some of this, actually just take a little bit of that, and scrape off some of this brown excess. Okay, and I'm going to grab a dab of white, and this is for those more intense highlight areas, a little bit more white, and a little bit more of this cadmium yellow. Okay, so this is for the wine glass. There's some very dark parts to it. This is a alizarin crimson that's neutralized a bit with this. These are parts for the reflection in the wine glass, which go towards a really warm red, that cadmium red, and parts of the highlights also go into this sort of yellow-orange territory as well. Okay, so we've addressed the tablecloth, the wine glass. Now let's address some of the colors and values that are both in the skull and in the toilet paper roll. So let's begin with the light portions, which are going towards both yellow and red. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a bit of yellow ochre and a little bit of cadmium yellow. Okay, so let's actually move this down a little bit. We're going to put it about right there. And I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium red into this mixture. Okay, just a touch for now. Alright, and let's mix a couple of steps of a lighter version of this. So again, this is for both the skull and the toilet paper roll because they're acting very similarly. Okay, so there are some brighter, lighter, whiter versions or parts of these objects. So add some white here up at the top. Okay. Put those areas of more intense highlights. The toilet paper roll in particular has some really bright areas of light. Okay. I've kind of reversed this, but it's still going to be a value scale. Sorry guys, that's a little confusing. Okay. So now I'm going to mix this down. So in the lightest parts, it's going kind of yellow. Okay, and I'm going to add a little bit more, it's a little bit more chromatic, so I'm going to add some more of the cadmium yellow into here. And also add a little bit of that back up into here as well. Get a little more cadmium yellow in there. Okay. And a little bit more white down into here. Okay, and then there's also, so there's some yellows in the lightest portions, and then in the light mass there's also some really rosy tones. Okay, so let's also, I'm going to grab a little bit of this. I'm going to go down here because I'm going to also mix some whiter versions out. I'm going to grab some of the cadmium red. Let's get a little bit more yellow ochre. And then also some of the alizarin crimson. Because it kind of has a rosy tone to it. And the rosy color is going to be going a little bit cooler. So the alizarin crimson is a red that cools, it's a cooling red. So cadmium red is very warm, very much leaning towards orange. Alizarin crimson is much cooler, it's leaning more towards purple and blue. Alright, now in the toilet paper and skull itself, there's nowhere that's going this intensely red, right? But what we just need to do is add a little bit of white into this. I'm not going to get rid of this completely though, because in case I need to remix other parts of this, I want to leave some of that. Okay. And in the skull, there are some areas that do go quite red, so you might use a tiny bit of that. Just not a lot. Okay, so I'm going to grab some white, put that into here. I'm also going to grab a little bit more of this yellow too. So a red and warm light can do really interesting things in a still life setup like this. You're infusing the light mass with color. Now, there's always color to light. It's just in this case, the light bulb I was using was very red, so it just makes some of the underlying color theory and light logic more evident. So if you have a warm light, the shadows are always going to be cooler. If you have a cool light, the shadows are always going to be going warmer. And there's always a type of temperature to the light. No matter the light that you're using, there's always a temperature to it. So that's always playing out in some way, but sometimes the lights are, just like in our colors, they might be very neutral. So that might not be super evident, right? But if you're able to get a very colorful light bulb to be working with, it can make that underlying color theory and light logic a lot more clear. And in the coming week or so, I'm also going to be setting up a homework assignment with a small still life using a blue bulb, so we'll be able to see how a blue bulb creates warm shadows. Okay, so I've mixed out some yellows, light yellows, I've mixed out some light reds, so that's addressing the light masses in the toilet paper roll, and then also in the skull. Now, it's very clear in the skull in particular. A lot of the toilet paper roll is awash in color. Though you can see in parts of the shadows that it is going cooler and greener. And it's not just any green, it's going towards kind of this phthalo green, a neutralized phthalo green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix out, get that red, alizarin crimson. I'm going to do a cool neutral using my alizarin crimson and my phthalo green. Okay. Alright. And then I'm also going to take just a little bit of this neutral this cool neutral that I'm mixing down here to mix a few mid-tone transition values from the light mass to the shadow mass. Okay. So let's check this out. Okay, that's looking nice and cool. So let's just mix a couple of values out of this green. Okay, so I'm going to use white to lighten it. That's a nice cool neutral. So the light mass is red from that red bulb, and the shadows then go cool and they go towards the complement of whatever the color of the light is. At least in a white object that becomes very clear, right? Because a white object doesn't really have a color. White is just sort of a neutral, white is not a color. So if you're using a colored bulb, it picks up the color of that bulb that you're using. Okay, here we go. Alright, so mixing out a few different neutralized greens to work with. And let's mix one more value in between here. Okay, and then let's also mix at least one kind of transition value and color between our light mass and our shadow mass. So I'm going to grab some of this red right here and also a little bit of one of the yellows from up here and add that in the green. Okay, so this is kind of a mid-tone transition, value and color. So you can see how that goes very neutralized because you're adding red and green together. So it really creates a neutral. Okay, so skull and toilet paper roll. This can also be applied to that book, which is it's a dark blue object. We could mix out, let's say, one more. Let's mix out a blue that's a little bit chromatic and a little bit lighter right here. The book is quite dark, so there's not going to be, you're not going to be seeing a lot of that color there. Okay, so we have one more kind of blue in there. For the parts of the pages of the book, we could also be using some of the yellows and reds that we've mixed, say even for the wine glass or the other objects. Okay, so you don't have to mix out a whole other value scale since we've really already mixed those colors that we need. Last thing would just be let's mix out a small value scale for the rose. So it's going to be very similar to this. I am going to mix out another little value scale for that because I want to make sure that I have enough paint. You could also get away with using some of the paint that you've already mixed there as well. Okay, so for the shadows, it's going cooler and more neutralized, so it's more towards our alizarin crimson. And we can even take some of the phthalo green to neutralize that. I could even grab some of this neutral over here. Okay. So that goes very, very dark. Okay. And then I'm going to start to add cadmium red into this. And the light portions of the rose are definitely going towards cadmium red. Okay, so let's add a cadmium red into that. Okay, and then into here. Alright, and let's do one more transition value between this and this. I'm just going to grab some of this and mix that in between. Okay, so the majority of the shadow parts of the rose would be in here. Alright, so let's also mix more of the light. So, cadmium red is a little too warm. It's not just cadmium red. Let's also clean off this palette knife a little bit more. Okay, so cadmium red, I'm going to get a little bit more, add a little bit of alizarin crimson. I probably should get more on my palette. Okay, and let's try adding just a little bit of white into this. A little bit of white. Okay, and then, so there are parts of the rose that are very intense like that, especially since it's a red object being awash in red light, so that heightens that red even more. Okay, so we got that very, very red. I made a mistake with the last little video and accidentally shot it as a time lapse. Sorry everyone. To get those lighter rosy hues for the flower, add more alizarin crimson and white. This palette addressed the majority of the values and colors it needed for this painting. Squint at your value scales as you mix them out to make sure that whatever color you are mixing, that it's reading on a value level. Have fun and reach out with whatever questions you might have.